everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
Youth have kind of played this disproportionate role in not only the climate movement, but also so many other movements. And I really think part of that is, young people, they realize that like what's happening now is gonna it's their future that's on the line, whether that's climate change or developments around human rights, whatever it may be. They're the ones who are inheriting the world that we're creating today.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today I'm joined by Nick Engelfried, the author of Movement Makers, How Young Activists Upended the Politics of Climate Change. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Scott.
As early as in your undergrad, you started on-campus activism to stop large fossil fuel projects in the Pacific Northwest. What motivated you and why?
Sure. So I was an undergrad in college back in the early 2000s. This was around the time that, people were kind of first starting to use the term climate movement as even like as a term that you would hear in academia and in the activism world. And so there was a lot of interest among, folks like me about in taking action on climate change, but also a lot of uncertainty about how do you even really go about tackling a project that big. We didn't have national campaigns around climate policy the way that we do today. And so I was in Oregon in the Pacific Northwest, and I got involved in a campaign to oppose a series of natural gas pipelines that at the time were meant to import liquefied natural gas. The developers eventually switched it once the fracking boom hit and changed them to export projects. But we were opposing the constructions of these pipelines through farmland, including land pretty close to where I was. I was at Pacific University, a little school in Northern Oregon. So that was kind of part of my gateway into climate organizing and climate activism.
And one of the movements that you started early on was something called the Blue Skies Campaign. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that.
Sure. So that was once I got out to Missoula, Montana. I moved to Missoula for grad school in would have been 2011. And at that time, there was a big push to export U.S. coal overseas. We export some coal now, but there was a push to dramatically increase the amount of coal we were exporting, especially to China and other developing economies in that part of the world. Most of the coal would have come from Montana and Wyoming, would have been transported by train to the West Coast, shipped out of ports they were trying to build in Oregon and Washington. And so I arrived in Montana just as kind of the opposition to this coal exports project was really ramping up. There was a proposal to build a huge new open pit strip mine. It was a project of Arch Coal. And there was the proposal to build this mine in eastern Montana. The trains would have actually passed through Missoula. So I was involved in launching Blue Skies campaign, which was kind of a not entirely student-led, but largely student young folks led campaign to kind of mobilize popular opposition to this project in western Montana. There was a lot of good organizing happening in eastern Montana where the mine was already, a lot of good organizing happening on the west coast where the ports were going to be built, but we were really kind of trying to bring western Montana fully into this opposition to the coal export. So we did a lot of stuff. We did rallies, we did protests, we did some nonviolent direct action. We actually did some protests on the railroad tracks in Missoula that the coal trains came through. And it was one small part of, a much larger regional effort to oppose coal exports, but we were eventually successful and we stopped the Otter Creek mine. It was Arch Coal walked away from that project, canceled it in 2016. And of the coal export terminals that coal companies were trying to build on the West Coast, there were at one time, I forget the exact number, but there were several proposals on the table, and not a single one of them was built. They were all defeated in the end.
That's really interesting. And again, given the fact that this is so early on, I wonder what attributed to that impact.
Yeah, I think it was a lot of things. People got really organized. I think that like once sort of the word got out about what was happening, there were a lot of people who got concerned about this. And, a lot of credit goes to, some of the larger organizations. Sierra Club was one that kind of helped mobilize people. And also, the communities around each of these projects, and also the tribes. I now live up in Bellingham, Washington, and the Lummi Nation up here, they were instrumental in stopping one of the last coal projects to go down, the Cherry Point terminal north of Bellingham. It was really them who stopped it by exercising their treaty protected fishing rights. So I think, once this movement against coal exports got started, you saw all kinds of people get involved from all walks of life. It was a really kind of diverse, broad-based movement, and I think that's really what made it successful.
Okay. All right. Now, there's another movement, one of many, of course, is the Reconnect Earth. I wonder if you could give us a little bit of a summary.
Sure. Yeah. So what I do now, several years ago, I was a youth climate activist, or identified that way myself for quite a few years. Several years ago, I kind of started to age out of that role. I wasn't really a youth activist anymore, and I kind of changed directions a little bit and got into environmental education. I also really started to focus on writing, which is how I ended up writing this book. And I founded an organization out here in Western Washington called Reconnect Earth. And what we do in Reconnect Earth is we really kind of try to bridge the gap between environmental education and environmental and climate activism. Our audience is mainly kind of folks of college age, like young adults, people in college, recently out of college. And we take folks out onto public lands in the North Cascades Mountains. We organize multi-day backpacking trips where we're out there learning about environmental issues, social justice issues, climate change, but also talking about activism. How do you actually take action on some of these issues in a way that gets beyond individual behavior change, but is actually looking at triggering systemic change through grassroots organizing?
So we're going to come back to that in just a second. One of the other things that you've been doing, aside from years of climate activism and environmental issue, is, of course, you've also been writing prolifically and have appeared in some of the mass media publications as well. How do you feel that media has played an important role in the climate movement that we're seeing today?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important. I think, media, whether it's more traditional media, social media, whatever it may be, it's one of the ways that, activists connect, that we get our message out there. One of the things that led to me writing this book, Movement Makers, is around the time that the climate strike movements, Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future, around the time that was really sort of hitting its peak a few years ago, there was a lot of good media coverage of that movement, but I started to notice that there was also a lot that was being missed. And it's for the most part, it's not the journalist's fault. It's just, if you're writing a short news article, there's only so much you can get into things. And there was a lot of stuff kind of going on behind the scenes, a lot of interconnections between, say, like the climate strikes movement, the movement for a Green New Deal, which was also taking off around that time, the fossil fuel divestment movement on college campuses. All of these movements were kind of interconnected, communicating with each other, building off each other, and also building on kind of the last 20 years of work that had been done by young folks and others organizing around climate change. So I started to realize, even as I was writing my articles, I was finding, I just can't, couldn't tell the full story that I really felt was important to tell about these this organizing that was going on. And so that's how I ended up writing this book. I think that one of the really important things media does, in addition to being a way for activists to connect with each other, is like it tells a story about what's happening, what has happened, that sort of informs the way we think about how movements come into being and make change. And that's really important because that informs how we go about trying to make change in the future.
So there's a lot of insights to be gained. And I think you talked about this notion of taking grassroots movement and creating systemic change. And when we think about climate action or climate movement, it's probably one of the most daunting things that we as a human species have faced probably in the last several centuries. Tell us about some of the principles, perhaps maybe the social or the collective action principles that are in your book.
Sure. So one of the things that kind of came up again and again as I was researching for this project, to do the research, I reached out, I interviewed folks who had either were involved in youth climate organizing at that time or had been involved at some point over the years. I talked to over 100 people. And one of the themes that came up again and again is there's a lot that goes on in grassroots social movements that you don't necessarily see unless you're really diving into it. I mean, for Greta Thunberg's an incredible, inspiring leader, but for every Greta Thunberg out there, there's thousands of people working behind the scenes, organizing meetings, communications, trying things out, see if they work, doing a lot of work that's honestly kind of unglamorous, but really important to the functioning of social movements. And so I think one of the lessons there, first of all, is a kind of inspiring one that, even if you don't think of yourself as kind of, the charismatic, inspiring leader type, which I mean, I certainly don't myself, there's still a lot of roles out there for you in the social movement, whether it's the climate movement or whatever you may be involved in. There's lots of ways to be involved. And it's also important to understand that movements don't just come out of nowhere. Sometimes when we're writing about a movement of the climate, about like the climate strikes, it's sort of tempting to portray it as, Greta Thunberg launched this movement. It just kind of rose from nothing. And the reality is there was a lot of groundwork that was laid in the US and all over the world by people doing climate organizing over the last 20 years that helped enable the climate strike movement to spread as quickly as it did once it got going. One of the things that really hit that home for me, just a brief anecdote, I was talking to a group of college students from Seattle who were involved in who had started a local hub of Sunrise Movement, which is the organization that really kind of popularized the Green New Deal. One of them mentioned to me she had gotten involved in that movement when an organizer from the National Sunrise Organization spoke on her campus at an event put on by this group called the Cascade Climate Network. And that got my attention because I'd actually been involved in the Cascade Climate Network back when I was an undergrad. It's sort of a regional organization that supports student climate activism in the Pacific Northwest. And it kind of made me realize how sort of the collection of organizations, national, regional, many of which kind of started around that time in the early 2000s or even the early 2010s. Many of these organizations actually really helped facilitate kind of the spread of the climate strike movement, the movement for a Green New Deal, all of that once those movements really kind of started to emerge around 2018, 2019.
All right, so I'm just going to take a step back and just kind of recap on a couple of the things that you mentioned. One is this notion around the complexity and the multi-layer of organizations. And I think one of the things that comes up to mind is organizing, and the details of organizing is very complex, especially given the fact that it's a volunteer movement and you're going to have people that's coming in and going out. So having that institutional knowledge and momentum and maintaining that momentum, I think, is a bit of a challenge. The other thing you talked about is this notion of multiplier effect. These cascading federal, regional, local organizations play a way to promulgate. More than promulgate, it is that they're also the hands and foot. They're physically on the campuses, sharing these stories, recruiting, actively involved, and they're the voices and really the hands and feet that's actually making it happen, so that the individuals can actually receive that information and do something with it. So there's a lot of moving parts. How do you ensure that as youth come in and go out through these movements, that you're having some sort of continuity and some level of rigor and standardization?
Great question. Yeah, I think that's honestly one of the one of the biggest things that we grapple with in kind of student organizing, because you do have students kind of cycling in and out as they arrive at school, graduate, age out of the movement. And I think some of the kind of branches of the climate movement that have done this most successfully are groups that have some kind of sort of national coordinating body that can kind of help foster that continuity. A great example is if we look at the fossil fuel divestment movement. This is the movement trying to get universities, other institutions to divest from fossil fuel companies. One of the strengths of that movement is you have your student groups organizing on individual campuses that have sort of very specific goal to get like that university to divest from fossil fuels. It's a very kind of tangible, real feeling goal. And at the same time, you've got kind of your national and regional networks. For example, there's a organization called Divested, which is now kind of one of the main national coordinating bodies in the divestment movement. And what they're doing, they're not like directing things so much as just kind of providing opportunities for students to gain experience, to network with each other. They have a fellowship program. Students can participate that and develop organizing skills that they can apply to their college campuses. They hold, gatherings where students from different campuses can get together and exchange ideas. And so these kind of national umbrella organizations serve a role in kind of maintaining that continuity and sort of allowing all of these different, local campus-based groups to connect with each other.
Makes perfect sense. Now, why is it that youth is so critical? And again, I'm not just talking about climate movement, but whether it's post Vietnam War, for instance, or any other big movements that has had anything to do with human rights, for instance, youth are critical. And I wonder why their voices in particularly seem to rise above the noise.
Sure, great question. And I totally agree. It's not just the climate movement. When I wrote this book, Movement Makers, I kind of made a conscious decision to focus on the youth climate movement. And that's not to say that there's not, lots of great, climate organizing work being done by folks who aren't youth. But my, reason for focusing that was really kind of what you said. Like youth have kind of played this disproportionate role in not only the climate movement, but also so many other movements. And I really think part of that is, young people, they realize that like what's happening now is gonna it's their future that's on the line, whether that's climate change or developments around human rights, whatever it may be. They're the ones who are inheriting the world that we're creating today. And there's also just a certain I'm trying to think how to say this in a way that like doesn't sound patronizing, because that's not how I mean it at all. There's a certain kind of idealism that you find in young people. And when I use that word, I don't mean like a naive idealism. I just mean really kind of like a eagerness to take it on, to make change, to get things done. And it can be really easy to kind of lose that. I know I've struggled with that a little bit myself over the years. Like once you've kind of been in the trenches a long time, you've seen wins, but you've also seen defeats. It's easy to lose some of kind of that initial spark that, a lot of young activists really bring to the table, and that can, inspire them to try really new things that, other folks may not have thought about. The climate strikes is a great example. Like that was a brilliant tactic that the Fridays for Future movement developed, skipping school, or eventually it became, skipping work or whatever you may be doing to protest for the climate. Very simple, very easily replicable. Almost anyone can participate, but it was a really kind of new idea that nobody had tried on that scale before. And that's the kind of thing you get when you have, young people bringing kind of fresh voices, fresh ideas to the movement.
So walk us through, because I feel that the last 3 years in particular has been really the critical tipping point. And I've said this before on the podcast, where we've had the founder of We Don't Have Time and many others of that, caliber. And 3-4 years ago, I think we were somewhat hesitant to openly talk about some of these topics, even fear of retaliation or even personal injury, for instance. That's not the case anymore. So walk us through, aside from kind of the 20 years of groundwork, the key sets of events that has really led to that tipping point where I think we are starting to really make some positive progress on a global scale.
Yeah, so I think there were kind of a few factors that really started to come together and converge. It was really kind of like the later part of 2018 and then going into 2019. One of them was certainly the climate strikes. Greta Thunberg was over there in Sweden, started that. international movement. It took off in Europe, then spread to the US and other countries around the world. So we had that happening. At the same time, it was right around that same time that Sunrise Movement group I mentioned earlier, they held a sit-in at the congressional office of Nancy Pelosi, who, this is November 2018. So we just had the election. She was the incoming House Speaker. And they did that at a really strategic time when, Democrats had just taken over the US House, were kind of solidifying their agenda going into that session of Congress. So that got a lot of attention. Then you had the fossil fuel divestment movement, which the divestment movement has been around for a while, but it was really kind of enjoying sort of a renaissance around that time. DivestEd, an organization I mentioned earlier, they were kind of, they were just kind of coming onto the scene, really kind of helping to reinvigorate the divestment movement. And all of these different movements, they weren't happening in isolation. They were feeding off of each other. For example, I talked with an organizer from DivestEd early on in my research for this book, who told me how they were seeing more students arrive at college kind of already knowing about the climate movement, already wanting to get involved in divestment because they'd been involved in things like the climate strikes or some of the other movements and organizations connected with the climate strike. So it was really kind of an exciting sort of moment of kind of reaching, I think, kind of critical mass around sort of interest in climate organizing, climate activism. And it really kind of peaked in, late 2019, that September. We had, 8 days of climate strikes and other mobilizations around the country coinciding with a UN event. We had over 7 million people around the world get out into the streets, by far the largest outpouring of public support for climate action we've ever seen. And that did a lot. Of course, soon after that, we had COVID. It became more difficult to organize large mobilizations. But, the impact from all that organizing, it didn't just fade away in 2019. That was something that stayed in people's memories, and there was still organizing going on even with COVID. And I honestly think that's why we saw last year we passed the first major piece of climate legislation in the US. It certainly wasn't everything we need. We've still got a lot of work to do. But the fact that we were able to pass something at all around climate in the Inflation Reduction Act, I don't think that ever would have happened without climate organizing, specifically youth climate organizing. I think that's what finally made climate sort of become a priority for people like Joe Biden, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and lawmakers like them.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. I want to just follow up on something that you said, which is during the COVID period. So you could make the argument that it would have been a hibernating time frame where there was not a lot of things happening in a public space, but yet there was. And I wonder if you could kind of unpack that 2-3 year period when we were locked down. Aside from holding on to some of the protests that happened a few years back, what were some of the things that were happening back then?
Sure. Yeah. So COVID was a really interesting time for all of us, but especially, in kind of the activism, climate activism sphere. It was, on the one hand, it was a reality. We didn't have like the huge, in-person mobilizations that we'd had just before then. It just became really hard to do under COVID. But like you said, there was still a lot going on. One of the things about the youth climate movement, especially, today in the last few years, is how they, use, social media, Zoom, kind of the online world to coordinate so many of their activities. And so I think they were able to adapt really well. I actually, early on in COVID, I talked with, youth organizers in different parts of the country who are actually telling me now we actually have more time to organize, to get on Zoom and coordinate things because we're all in lockdown. And some of the things they did, for one thing, that was right around when we were gearing up to the 2020 election, and youth activist organizations mobilized really well through that, coordinating. Like Sunrise Movement, for an example, is an example of a group that coordinated organize students to do voter outreach, whether by phone, by text message, whatever it may be. They would run huge virtual phone banks, have students calling voters in key districts. So we had that going on. We also had, even though, we didn't have the huge like mass mobilizations that we had before COVID, there were, especially as, the lockdown started to ease up and things became a little easier to do in person. Like we did have, protests happening in places like DC and elsewhere. Again, Sunrise coordinated some protests in DC as sort of negotiations were going on around, first it started as Build Back Better, then it became the Inflation Reduction Act. And they really kind of helped, keep a certain amount of public attention on the climate issue as that was going on. So I think that folks, did a really good job, like coming up with creative ways to navigate COVID. And it's going to be really interesting to see, now that we're kind of coming out of that, at least, it's not the same level of crisis that it was formerly. It's going to be really interesting to see what the movement kind of does next as, large, mass gatherings become more feasible to organize.
Yeah. I think a couple of things come to mind. One is certainly, I think during the lockdown, there was a lot of things happening, but around the world, we had fires, tornadoes, flooding, you name it. And I think for the first time, really, I think in a more recent history, all of us in some way have personally experienced some of the climate impacts. The other thing is COVID also helped us bring a notion of this risk from the mortality aspect from COVID itself and how vulnerable we are as people. And I think that also correlated with climate change. So because again, we've had guests here before, some of the challenges that they've articulated is that we as humans, so just the way our brains are wired, we're not very good at assessing risks that's much further out. We are better at assessing risks that are things that's more closer or tangible. And I think from a climate impact, we're starting to really get to a point where there's a lot of tangibility, things that we can actually connect on a real-time basis. Now, at the time of the recording, we have an active budget negotiation that's happening in the U.S. Congress, and the Republicans have specifically asked for certain reductions. Some of those is directly hitting the budget of EPA. Others are hitting, I would say, things that's supporting climate action as well. And I wonder your thoughts around that, as well as the counter movement around anti-woke, whatever or however you decide to define that as.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I definitely think, that the first point you're speaking to, the increase in extreme weather over the last few years, I think it has kind of hit a sort of a level that, even people who may formerly not have thought much about climate change, it's becoming kind of hard to ignore. That's not to say there aren't people who, manage to deny it anyway. There always are, but it's becoming harder and harder to deny that, like, we're seeing changes, the types of changes that, scientists have been warning us about for years. And I definitely think that has helped put momentum behind, grassroots climate initiatives for sure, both in terms of, people being a little bit more receptive to the message. And also, I've spoken with a lot of activists who have, told me kind of like, the reason they became inspired to join the movement is because, they were affected by, wildfires on the West Coast, or, hurricanes on the East Coast, or whatever it may have been. And that kind of played a role in their climate awakening. And then, the next point you spoke to, as with any successful social movement, any movement that starts to have an impact, as you start to have more impact, you're going to start to get more and more, pushback from the opposition. And so I think, what's going on with kind of budget negotiations in Congress right now, this is something that, we've seen again and again throughout the history of the climate movement is, the opposition will kind of try to undercut action by defunding it, by, making sure that EPA doesn't have enough money to do its job. That's something that they've been doing for a long while. And I think it's not surprising that they're, pursuing that again. I think the answer to that is we've got to continue to kind of keep the urgency of the climate crisis in front of people's minds. And I think that's where the climate movement, where grassroots organizing comes in, is we've got to continue to remind people like how urgent this is, how much of a priority it needs to be, that we need the EPA to be able to do its job. We need programs that are helping us make the transition to renewable energy.
So for our listeners that may be youth or not, so what's advice for them in terms of how do they get involved with climate activism or support other activists?
Yeah, great question. Well, one of the wonderful things about the climate movement is there are so many ways to get involved. If you are a young person yourself, whether you're in high school, college, whatever it may be, get involved at your school or in your community. If there's an existing climate organization on your campus, join it. And if there's not, you can start one. And you can also, in many cases, do that with the support of some of these national, organizations who provide trainings, who provide resources. Look up groups like divestment if you're interested in divestment, Sunrise Movement if you want to take action on a Green New Deal. Another group I didn't mention earlier, but they're really important, is 0 Hour. They were actually started by high school students back in 2018, and they really played a role in spreading the climate strike movement in the US. So any of those organizations are great to look up if you're not sure how to go about like starting something at your school and in your community. And for folks who don't identify as youth anymore, there are a lot of ways that we can support the youth movement. I think one of the great things about the climate strikes when they were at their height was that you not only saw so many young people getting out and participating, you also saw a lot of older people coming out to those marches and marching alongside folks, providing that solidarity, and that's really important. So I would say figure out how to support the youth climate movement wherever you are. Of course, there's other things we can do, donating, that sort of thing. But I really believe that there's a role for pretty much everybody in the climate movement. You just got to figure out kind of what works for you.
Super. So with that, I have been joined by Nick Engelfried, the author of Movement Makers, How Young Activists Upended the Politics of Climate Change. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.